Hello, everyone. Richard here at Calvin Wazoo, and welcome back to another episode where the wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. It is back to Frank Zappa, one album at a time, and I am up to this one. Okay, the London Symphony Orchestra. This is the CD release, the Ryko disc release. It was also released separately into different vinyl releases. This is volume 2, and this is volume 1. Now, I have a lot of prepared notes because this is one of the recordings that there's a lot of nuanced information about. And I have some very particular thoughts about the recording. And I thought of the way that I wanted to say it. And so I put it down so I could remember the much of the information that I am basing this video on is coming from this book here, The Big Note, and also from Barry Miles' biography of Frank Zappa. And of course, there's some material also that's going to be coming from mentions, from the autobiography by Frank Zappa. Because Frank had a lot to say about this whole experience. And there were some who were involved in that experience who also ended up having a lot to say. And there are people who have drawn conclusions about Frank and his creative milieu and his creative muse that sometimes I think are said without a full understanding of what may have been going on, and also the bigger picture about Frank, and also the bigger picture about creative personalities like Frank. So when this project came to be, now we've got, all right, so we know that the first volume, let's see, was released in June of 1983, and volume 2 was released in September of 1987, so more than 4 years after volume 1. And then a Zappa Records 2 CD was released in September of 2012. And then the Ryko disc CD, let's see, 1983, 1980. Ryko was 1995, all right, which is what I have. I have the Ryko disc from 1995. And the CD, the order of the tracks on the CD are how they were intended to be presented, the order there. However, that order is not followed with the vinyl releases, and we'll get into that. So I guess I kind of want to start off about orchestral music and Frank Zappa. He composes. I really do believe Frank was more than just a pop musician who wrote pop songs or who wrote rock songs. He was a true composer. And for the most part, he did choose a band, a rock and roll band, for presentation of his music, because in many respects, he couldn't get an orchestra to play it. So sometimes he has music that was played with a band, whether it was the Mothers of Invention or other bands that he put together, that are renditions of orchestral work that he's done. And he's also taken material that began with the band, or even a guitar solo, that was later transcribed into an orchestral piece. So the first thing I think it's important to remember that Frank's music was not composed with the intention of being difficult just to be difficult. Frank understood how difficult his music was to play. For example, in the, I think it's in the Yellow Shark, or it might have been in Orchestral Favorites. There's a part in there where a musician is playing a cello with a wah-wah attached to it. And Frank encouraged her to continue to play a certain part faster and faster and faster. And she got to a point where she told Frank to his face, "Frank, I can't play it any faster." And hearing that, Frank withdrew. Okay? He wanted to see how far he could go, with that. And there are other musicians who have relied, and other composers who have relied on electronic instrumentation because their fingers can't play fast enough. Ryuichi Sakamoto is one of those who uses electronic equipment. He'll play something on a keyboard, but then he'll speed it up electronically because he simply can't play it that fast. But that's how he hears it and wants it presented. Frank has stated in other forums about, even with his guitar solos, and Dweezil has confirmed this as well in other places, that during a guitar solo, Frank sets out to play what's in his head, and that he admits sometimes his fingers just can't keep up with what he's hearing inside his head. His fingers cannot do what his mind musically is setting up as the goal. So this is sometimes, I think, why some people dismiss Frank as being one of the greatest guitar players ever, because technically he really didn't have the chops to play even his own music at times. So yeah, you're gonna consistently find him in the list of the greatest guitar players, ever, but you rarely see him listed in the top 10, and generally never do you see him listed among the top 5 guitarists. And this is why Frank would hire other guitar players like Steve Vai or Adrian Belew and Ray White and others to play parts that he could not play, or also that he would not play, because Frank has admitted that he can't sing and play the guitar at the same time. Of course, I'm saying all this in present tense, so he could not sing and play guitar at the same time. And that's why he had other guitarists who had some seriously good chops and were technically really excellent musicians. But Frank's greatness as a guitar player goes well beyond playing with precise articulation, all right? His tone and timbre, in my opinion, are unmatched among his peers. There are certainly, you have some really unique guitar players, that are considered greats. Jimi Hendrix is one. Jeff Beck is one. But then there are a lot of really excellent guitar players that get elevated to the top 10 status, who they're very outstanding, both past and present. But when you listen to a recording of them playing without knowing who's playing, it would be a challenge to identify who that guitarist is, just based on their sound and technique alone. So even if you've had them put them all together on a stage for a live concert, and there certainly have been situations like this, and each take a turn at a solo, none of them, in my opinion, really play a solo that none of the others couldn't play themselves. All right? They're really good guitar players, but they don't have that extra thing that Frank had, that Jimi Hendrix had, that Jeff Beck had, and some others. Very small number of others. But Zappa's tone, his playing style, is instantly identifiable in a blind listen. And really, there are not many guitar players, in my experience, with whom that is possible. So he had high expectations for reproducing his music, and he demanded a lot out of his musicians. And there are many interviews with musicians who have worked with Frank who talk about his demanding nature on precision. I mean, he wrote songs that embarrassed other players because they couldn't play something the way he wanted them to. Yo Mama is a classic example, a song written about somebody who couldn't play what Frank wanted them to play. So when we come to the London Symphony Orchestra recordings, we have two stories. One is of enthusiasm for the material by both Kent Nagano, who was the conductor doing this, and also with some of the musicians who participated in this. And then there is this story of frustration, particularly on Frank's part, which is why the recordings ended up being divided into two releases. That's very clear with that. So, the background on this, we'll start off. Kent Nagano was hired to conduct an orchestra for these pieces based on his reputation for precision and management of complex rhythms and rhythmic structures. So he had this reputation, and so Frank sought him out. In fact, the first time Nagano met Frank was at a concert in San Francisco during an intermission. And it was interesting because Nagano said that, it was the first time he had ever been to a rock concert, and it was everything that he feared. He wore earplugs. But then he went backstage, and Frank showed him some sheet music and asked him about it. And Nagano kind of demurred on his opinion because, there was a lot there he needed to think about and before he would formulate an opinion. But he was also clearly excited by, initially by what he saw. So Frank said, okay, let's, take it. Well, about 4 months later, Frank calls him on the phone, and he offers to Nagano to conduct the London Symphony Orchestra with this music. And Nagano thought he could be a little coy with Frank, and so he hedged a little bit and kind of says, well, I don't know. But then Frank gave him an ultimatum. He says, hey, I'm going to give you 15 seconds to give me an answer. Otherwise, I'm just going to find somebody else. That's Frank. He had his idea that he wanted to have portrayed in exactness. And he chose Nagano because Nagano had a reputation for this type of exactness. And in terms of orchestral music, this was definitely the trend over nearly the last 100 years, beginning with the Romantic period, where that exactness was being expected, that musicians played the notes on the sheet. The only interpretation might be in tone or maybe even tempo or something like that. Prior to the Romantic period, orchestra musicians were given a lot more latitude to embellish their parts during performances. That changed in the Romantic period, where composers were saying, you're going to play the notes. And the repertories and the conservatories also instilled that. So, faced with that ultimatum, Nagano said, fine, yes, we'll do this, okay? Now, Nagano admitted that this was some seriously complex, difficult music. And sometimes when you listen to it, and unless, if you don't have a musician's ear, you may not necessarily pick up on the complexity. It's certainly different, but that complexity is there nonetheless. And when it came to putting things together, there was this time crunch. Everything was compressed, all right? Zappa normally would rehearse a band anywhere from 2 to 4 months before taking them out on the road. They were very well rehearsed, right down to his hand signals, so that they could shift and change on the fly, because you never knew what Frank was going to want you to do. And also, in Frank's mind, when he hired musicians, he believed he owned you, okay? You were at his service. Now, with the London Symphony Orchestra, instead of having 2 to 4 months to rehearse, he had 4 days. 4.5 days. That's it. And part of that rehearsal was actually doing a live performance of the material. That's how they were going to rehearse. They were going to have a concert. So when things kind of are starting to get set up, especially for the live shows, the rehearsals, Frank was really pissed when he found out backstage that there was a bar. And he accused players of getting roasted, is the term that he used, which that comes from his comments in the Real Frank Zappa book, that none of the other people seem to really see the same thing. So there's lots of commentary by Frank that he believed the reason many of the musicians were unable to play his music were because they were intoxicated because of the bar that they would go to during breaks, that they would even leave the recording area, and go to a pub during the break. But none of that was really observed by Nagano, and Nagano would not have tolerated intoxicated musicians. So, we have to balance the sources and think about what might be going on. The other thing that occurred, which undoubtedly created a lot of tension between the musicians and Frank, was Frank's attempt to rearrange player placement for the live rehearsals. Normally, the orchestra is going to set up in a standard way, okay? But he was trying to do some recording during these live performances, so he really moved people around, and it was a very small stage, and this annoyed some people. And in fact, at the end, he abandoned any effort to rearrange seating the orchestra for the live performances. That was something that he could do with a larger space, which he had with the recording studio. But you got that going on, so there's this tension. You've got extremely difficult music. You've got really short rehearsal time. And you've got a composer who is, financing this project, who knows what he wants and expects to get it, and is going to let you know if he's not getting it. Now, when it was all said and done, Nagano and many of the musicians that were involved felt very pleased with the outcome, considering the complexity of the music and the recording, and also considering the timeline under which they were operating. So, in fact, there were some musicians who had worked with Frank before, who, for like 200 Motels or other orchestral projects, when they heard about this project with the London Symphony Orchestra, they asked to be a part of it. All right, so there were musicians who were very enthusiastic about this. So I want to read some things here from the big note regarding some of this. It was really quite interesting. So there was so Ed Mann, who was brought in for and then let me double check. So he was brought in for some percussive instruments. He said, "I played the harder mallet parts. Zappa gave them to me a month before the sessions so I could learn them, the kind of thing that no one could sight read. We rehearsed for a week. They had some of the parts ahead of time, but yes, they are great players, and they nailed it. The music was difficult and required some private practice time, so a lot of the players were just plain pissed off. The percussionists were great, though, really into it. I mean, the London Symphony Orchestra had a reputation of being excellent at sight reading, but most of the music the orchestra plays is well known and also follows predictable patterns. So even when you get into 20th century composers, where things are a little more difficult, they'll get more rehearsal time than maybe what they got in this situation. Now, oboist John Lawley recalled from the sessions, he said, there were 12 extra rehearsals before the concert day running from January 7th to the 10th. I can't think of any other project that has had anywhere near that many rehearsals. We then had 6 recording sessions in Twickenham after all this, so it was given an extraordinary amount of time. So even with that condensed window, there was a lot of rehearsal going on with this music. And then Kent Nagano said, that's an extraordinary amount of rehearsal for an orchestra of the caliber of the London Symphony, where they can oftentimes go in and read and record a piece all within the same 3-hour session. So when they were met with the request from us asking for so much rehearsal time, I think it threw them off guard. They couldn't conceive of what possibly could take so much time to rehearse. So, yeah, the orchestra may have had inappropriate expectations. Perhaps there was a little bit of hubris going on both sides. But regardless, the Kent Nagano likened, it says here, likened Frank Zappa's compositions to those of Charles Ives, Pierre Boulez, Olivier Messiaen, and Elliott Carter. So the biggest obstacle, this is from Kent Nagano, to Frank's music centering into standard repertoire is the fact that it demands a technique that is not normally required of your average symphonic musician. That's not to say that they can't play it, but the technique involved is way ahead of its time. 30 years down the road, orchestral musicians will have that technique. So we're talking, this is, the early 1980s, and he's saying 30 years down the road. So like current times, or, the early part of the 21st century, that is when these techniques may become more established with orchestral musicians. So yeah, this was really quite interesting with the dynamics that are going on. Now, the recording engineer, when they put this together, said there were about 1,000 edits to the tape where there was an effort made to remove the mistakes. So that was pretty extraordinary for this. And that led to the division into the two releases. Volume 1 represents the orchestra playing the best, the playing everything the way the notes are on the page, in the way, Frank wanted it, with the least number of errors. That is this one. So that's why they're out of sequence. All right, so the sequence that ended up on the CD release, it starts with Bob and Dacron, the first movement and the second movement, then Sad Jane, first movement and second movement, then Mo and Herb's Vacation, first movement, second movement, third movement, and then Envelopes, followed by Pedro's Dowry, followed by Bogus Pomp, and then closing was Strictly Gentile. On this one, we only get, I better pull all of this out so I can see it. We get Sad Jane, Pedro's Dowry, and Envelopes on side 1. And side 2 is Mo and Herb's Vacation, all 3 movements. So that was released first. And then it was much later that you get this one. As I said, this was released in, now it slips my mind, 1987, I think I said. And on this one, you're going to get the rest of the material, which is going to include Bogus Pomp, which is all of side 1, and side 2 is Bob and Dacron and Strictly Gentile. So, interesting perspective that Frank had about this. He didn't think he was going to be making a whole lot of money on this, and he didn't think that it was even going to sell well, simply because of what normally happens with orchestral music. He said this album cost about 5 times what it costs to make a rock and roll record, and it'll probably sell about 1/10 of what a rock and roll record would sell. So you can't do too many of those without rapidly starving to death. So when we look at this one, that first release, the initial pressing of 6,000 copies sold out in 6 weeks. All right, by November of 1984. So by June of 1983, it had, or let's say June of 1983, was that when it was released, or would that have been after? June of 1983 was when it was released. So 6 weeks after that, somewhere late August, early September, it had sold 6,000 copies. That first run sold out. By November of 1984, it had sold close to 100,000 copies. So this really did very well in the market. So when listening to them, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the music. But one thing I will say is that listening to this one and comparing it to this release that came later, you definitely hear the mistakes with some of the songs on here. You definitely hear the orchestra just not gelling with a lot of the pieces. This one, you do hear much more precision, and it's a better experience. So I'm going through this not according to this order, but I am going to go through according to the order here that are on the actual vinyl releases. And so with Sad Jane, first and second movements, this is based on some scenes, a ballet that's going on here. The two parts are about Jane's clothes and then what Jane's body really looks like. Okay. It's difficult, I mean, I enjoy the music, and I've played, before in my youth, I would play in symphonic groups. So I've played some complex music before, and I really appreciate nothing like this, but I really appreciate what is going on. The musical themes are really intriguing, and the percussion parts. Ed Mann was right. The percussion parts, the orchestra really, they nail it. They get it, and they play throughout all the pieces with great precision. This has somewhat of a dolorous melody. It's both beautifully sad and animated at the same time. I mean, we're talking about Jane's clothes and what her body really looks like. So yeah, there's a little bit of animation there going on with this kind of very doleful mood. It reminds me a little bit about her name escapes me, of that character, the female lead character in Nightmare Before Christmas. I mean, visually, that's kind of what Sad Jane calls to mind. And then, the song does, or the piece proceeds into a lot more expressive and even hopeful sentiment that is driven by the strings. Pedro's Dowry, the next track, it begins with this cacophony of the percussion instruments, and it leads into this seductive, almost swanky, Broadway-esque advance with the orchestra, with a lot of muted brass and the ponderous percussion. It is definitely filled with a lot of polyrhythms. So the inspiration I want to read for Pedro's Diary to kind of get an idea with that. This is, of course, all in the order of the CD. Here we go. Pedro's Diary was inspired by a real woman who lived in Hawaii. Frank said she has virtually a whole wall that slides open looking out onto the sea. And this is a woman who is a lonely lady who wishes that she could get reamed by a guy who ties his shirt in a knot at the waist and stands up in a rowboat. So in my scenario, her ship comes in. So yeah, you do really get this mixture of sounds that do evoke a combination of loneliness and seduction. Really quite good. There's a part that has bass clarinet and oboe that's playing over the percussion that's really very sweet. It's in later part. And again, all the percussive sounds are just absolutely incredible with this. Then we get Envelopes, which has appeared in other recordings in the Zappa discography. It has some really interesting harmonic themes. Just really like the way the various harmonies in the different sections of the orchestra are working together and coming out. It has almost Baroque-like moments. Really quite an exquisite piece. And, again, with this particular album, I might hear what I think is probably a mistake or something like that, or something not exactly that I would guess Frank wanted that way, but it's still a really good performance. And then you've got Mo and Herb's Vacation, which the music All right, you've seen the videos, of these pendulum, these balls on different lengths of string so that they kind of go down in a slant, right? And then you push them all and then let go. So they, at first, they're swinging in unison, but then they quickly start to diverge and swing. And there are moments when the different patterns of the balls swinging back and forth are rhythmically in sync, so to speak. But then there are parts when the balls are just like going like crazy all over the place. This it looks like complete chaos, and then they come back together into a pattern, and then finally at the end they go back to the in unison how everything started. That's Mo and Herb's vacation. Okay. Um, they everything kind of does start in unison, but then it just things they go into different directions, and sometimes they meld together really well. In other parts, it just seems really chaotic, but it's still all syncing in some way. And then it all comes back together. Really, really remarkable piece. Now we get to volume 2. And yes, we definitely can hear a different, almost an entirely different orchestra with some of these pieces. With Bogus Pomp, there are clear sections where there are instruments that are out of rhythm and out of tune. This was one of Frank's principal complaints with the orchestra. You hear that. And there are some parts. All right, so with Bogus Pop, you've got some themes that appear in, for example, 200 Motels, such as "This Town is a Sealed Tuna Sandwich." That musical theme is within Bogus Pop. And some of these parts, especially with the brass parts, it just sounds lackadaisical. Like they're just, and I don't know if that's because, as Frank said, it's because they went out and they got pissed during a break, or the music was just, they didn't have enough time to rehearse it or whatever. Then we have Bob and Dekron. So there's a string bass section in there with these laugh boxes that are added in that are supposed to represent the girls that Bob is going after. And it's really, really good. The string bass and the combination of those laugh boxes, check that section out. It's really, really, really good. I mean, the concept, the idea, the musical idea that's being presented there is really intense. And I don't, in general, pick up on as many flaws with Bob and Dacron as I do in Bogus Pomp. So it seems to be a little better performance. But there are some points where the timbre of the musicians is it lacks intensity. And then the closer is Strictly Gentile, entire side. It's got a rather ponderous start. And actually, it's not the entire side. It's Bob and Dacron and Strictly Gentile are on side 2. But yeah, Strictly Gentile has, which sounds great on 200 Motels. That is the London Philharmonic Orchestra, I believe, for 200 Motels, as opposed to the London Symphony Orchestra. But the performance of Strictly Gentile on this record sounds a bit slurred. It just kind of lacks both articulation in the playing, and overall, it just kind of lacks intensity. It doesn't have that same intense buildup that you get with the 200 Motels. So yeah, I could again see why Frank was really disappointed with that. So, musically, those are my impressions of the two releases, or actually the total release here, the Ryko disc of the London Symphony Orchestra, and then we've got Volume One, and then Volume Two. Um, so yeah, leave your comment in the down under on your thoughts about this. What do you think? Hey, am I describing the performance, etc., to your knowledge as the way you hear it or know about it, or is there something else you might know that I didn't mention in this presentation about it? You know, I like getting the comments. It's very interesting because sometimes, often, I shouldn't just say sometimes, oftentimes, I will be made aware of something that I didn't know. So, and also, yeah, like the video, it helps with its distribution, even if you don't subscribe. You can follow me also on Instagram at newsdude76. That's NEWZDUDE76. And then I have a Facebook page called Calvin Wazoo, where you will find not just these videos, but other content musically related. So you can subscribe or follow that Facebook page as well. And remember to pray for the people inside your head, for they won't be there when you're dead.